There is a question that has haunted this hobby for over 30 years. A question that Games Workshop planted deliberately, like a seed pressed into stone, never quite anticipating the shape of the obsession it would eventually become. A question so precisely calibrated in its incompleteness that even those who have spent decades immersed in this setting, who can recite the battle honors of obscure second founding chapters and trace the political machinations of ancient heresy-era councils from memory, are stopped cold by it, left staring into a void where there should be names, faces, histories. Where did they go? 20 Space Marine legions, 20 sons of the Emperor, each one carrying a fragment of the most ambitious genetic engineering project in the history of human civilization. 20 armies of transhuman warriors, each numbering in the hundreds of thousands, built across decades of painstaking development for the singular purpose of conquering a galaxy and returning the scattered remnants of humanity to a unified empire. And yet, when historians in the 41st millennium reach for the full count, when they look at the official registries and the halls of honor and the statues that were supposed to celebrate the greatest military undertaking in human history, 2 of those 20 are simply gone, not lost in battle in any conventional sense, not turned to chaos and listed alongside the traitors whose names have been turned into warnings, not destroyed fighting some unimaginable alien threat in the outer dark where no witnesses survived to report the loss. They are gone in a way that is qualitatively different from any other absence in the setting. Their records are described in official Imperial documents as expunged. The entries that should contain their names and their histories and their battle records have been removed so thoroughly that the documents containing those removals are themselves classified, the very act of erasure buried under layers of institutional secrecy. Their monuments have been defaced. Their statues, the great life-sized renderings of their primarchs that stood alongside the other 18 in the vestiary of the Imperial Palace, have been removed from their plinths. Not replaced, not repositioned, simply taken, leaving 2 stone pedestals standing in a row of 18 standing figures, visible gaps that everyone who passes through that hall can see, and that no one is permitted to explain. The 2nd Legion, the 11th Legion. Their numbers exist, etched into the official catalogues of the Legiones Astartes, and those numbers are the entirety of what remains. No names for the legions themselves, no homeworlds recorded, no campaigns documented, no primarchs described or depicted in any accessible Imperial source, no tactical doctrines preserved, no battle hymns transcribed, no color schemes noted in the heraldic records that the Adeptus Terra maintains for every other military organization of consequence. Whatever they were, whatever their warriors believed, whatever worlds they fought on, whatever culture they built over decades of the Great Crusade, has been scraped from the records so comprehensively that even individuals who were alive during the Great Crusade, who must have encountered these legions personally, who in some cases fought alongside them for years, eventually stopped speaking of them. Stopped speaking of them not merely in public contexts where the Edict of Obliteration might demand silence, but in private, in moments of personal reflection, in the inner monologues that the novels give us access to. The silence is as complete in the minds of characters as it is in the Imperial archives. And that silence, that particular totality of it, is the most terrifying thing about this entire mystery. In a setting that has given us 10,000 years of meticulously constructed and obsessively detailed mythology, in a universe where even the most remote corners of history have been catalogued and annotated and expanded upon and argued over by generations of dedicated writers and game designers and community scholars, the complete absence of any information about these 2 forces stands as something genuinely unique, something that was designed, with surgical precision, to feel like a wound in the historical record rather than a gap waiting to be filled, something that grows more substantial and more disturbing the longer you look at it, because the more you understand about the setting, the more clearly you see that the shape of what is missing is itself a form of information. Tonight, we are going to spend a long time in that wound. We are going to walk as close to its edge as the available lore permits, and we are going to look at every fragment of evidence that survived the erasure, every whispered hint that slipped through the cracks in the Imperial censorship, every cryptic comment made by characters who should know better than to speak at all on this subject. We will lay out what can be reasonably concluded, what remains genuinely and perhaps permanently uncertain, and why this particular mystery is, in the considered judgment of many who have spent serious time with it, the most perfectly constructed piece of background fiction that Warhammer 40,000 has ever produced. Settle in. This is going to take a while. Every moment of it is worth your time. Before we go any further, a quick moment, drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. It genuinely makes my day seeing these roll in from all over. And if this is the first video of mine you have found, consider subscribing. There is so much more to explore in this universe, and this channel is dedicated to doing exactly that, slowly and thoroughly, and with the kind of attention this lore deserves. Part 1. The Empty Pedestals. Let us set the stage properly, because you cannot feel the full weight of this mystery without first understanding what exactly it is that is missing. And what is missing is not a small thing. It is not a minor administrative oversight in the Imperial bureaucracy. It is something that, when you grasp the scale of what a Space Marine Legion actually is, begins to feel genuinely incomprehensible. A Space Marine Legion at the height of the Great Crusade is not a unit of soldiers in any conventional military sense. It is a civilization, a self-contained cultural institution of extraordinary complexity, with its own internal hierarchy and social structures, its own philosophical traditions and aesthetic sensibilities, its own accumulated mythology and institutional memory, its own fleet of warships ranging from personal craft to vessels the size of small cities, its own forge complexes producing weapons and armor, and the gene seed that sustains the Legion's biological continuity, its own recruitment network spanning entire star systems, and its own relationship to the broader political and social structures of the expanding Imperium. At full strength, a legion during the Great Crusade can number 250,000 warriors or more. Each warrior is the product of a years-long transformation process that begins when they are a child or adolescent and restructures their entire biology around a set of implanted organs derived from the genetic template of their primarch. Their bones are reinforced with a substance that makes them denser and stronger than natural bone. Their blood is enhanced with additional cell types that accelerate healing at rates that would seem miraculous to a baseline human. Their nervous systems are modified to process sensory information faster, to react more quickly, to endure pain without the kind of incapacitation it would produce in an ordinary person. They grow additional organs that serve functions ranging from the practical, a second heart, a lung capable of processing toxins, to the genuinely extraordinary, a gland that allows them to absorb nutritional and even memory-encoded information from the flesh of creatures they consume, a structure in their throat that can emit an ultrasonic pulse capable of incapacitating enemies, a third set of eyelids that can function as optical filters. And all of that is only the beginning of what separates a Space Marine from an ordinary human soldier. Layered on top of the physical transformation is a conditioning process of extraordinary depth, decades of hypnodoctrination and martial training, and ideological shaping that produces a warrior whose mental and emotional landscape is as different from a normal human's as their body is. They do not experience fear in the way humans do. They do not tire in the way humans do. They have been systematically given a relationship to violence and death that allows them to function effectively in situations that would break the psyche of an unmodified person. At the center of each legion, binding it together and giving it direction and meaning, is the Primarch. Even among the extraordinary things the Emperor created, the Primarchs are extraordinary. They are the product of his deepest genetic knowledge, engineered at a level of complexity that nobody else in human history has achieved or probably could achieve, each one designed to embody and amplify a particular set of qualities that the Emperor judged essential to his project. They are physically capable of feats that make even their own Space Marines seem limited by comparison, wrestling the structural members of crashed starships, surviving wounds that would destroy multiple regular Space Marines, fighting for days without rest against enemies that an entire legion might struggle to overcome. But the physical capability, astonishing as it is almost secondary to the quality of their presence. A Primarch walks into a room and the room changes, not metaphorically, Literally, in a setting where psychic power and warp resonance are physical forces with measurable effects, the presence of a Primarch alters the psychic environment of their surroundings. Their emotional states can be felt by the people around them. Their certainty, or their rage, or their grief radiates outward in a way that shapes the psychological state of everyone within range. The warriors of their legions, who are already bound to them through the genetic legacy of their gene seed, feel this with particular intensity. The Primarch is not just their commander. He is the living embodiment of everything their legion is built to be. He is the apex, the fullest realization, the standard against which every warrior in his legion unconsciously measures himself. This is why the erasure of 2 legions represents something so staggering. You are not removing regiments or divisions or even entire armies in the conventional sense. You are removing civilizations, with everything that implies about the depth and completeness of the erasure required. You are removing not just the warriors, but the ships and the forges and the records and the traditions and the cultural products, the artwork and the music and the philosophy and the theology that these organizations would inevitably have developed over decades of existence. You are removing the accumulated institutional knowledge of tens of thousands of years of collective human experience, distilled through the lens of extraordinary beings, into something uniquely powerful and uniquely irreplaceable. And then you are doing it again, for a second legion. In the vestry of the Imperial Palace, where Rogel Dorn walked and let his gaze travel across the row of statues of his Primarch brothers, the 2 empty plinths did not simply look bare. They looked like missing teeth. They looked like the spaces left by amputations. The plinth itself, the stone base from which a statue once rose, is a thing built to carry the weight of something enormous. A plinth without a statue is not just an absence, it is a declaration of absence. It draws the eye. It demands explanation. It sits in the row of its filled companions and refuses to be ignored, because the mind reaches for the pattern and finds a gap where the pattern should continue, and that gap is jarring in a way that a simple omission would not be. Dorn looked at those plinths. We know from the novel The Lightning Tower that he thought about them in connection with the impossibility of a Primarch turning against the Emperor. He connected them, in his private thoughts, to the question of whether a being like himself, like any of his brothers, could ever truly betray their father. And the fact that those empty plinths resonated with that question, that they were available to his mind as a relevant reference point when he thought about the limits of Primarch loyalty, tells us something. It tells us that whatever those empty plinths represented, Dorn associated it with failure of loyalty at the Primarch level, even if he did not fully understand the specifics. The other Primarchs knew, at least in broad terms, that something had happened to their 2 absent brothers. They knew because the plinths were empty. They knew because the gene seed records had been altered. They knew because the faces of certain warriors they had once known were now gone from the ranks, or had been replaced by warriors with subtly different faces who did not carry quite the same genetic markers they would have expected. They knew because the Imperium's administrative structures do not function in ways that make complete erasure entirely invisible to beings of Primarch-level intelligence who spend time examining things carefully. But knowing in broad terms and knowing the specifics are very different things, and the specifics were apparently controlled with sufficient effectiveness that even beings of this caliber were denied the full picture. What made them accept that denial? What could cause a being like Dorn, who famously questioned nearly everything and demanded justifications for policies he was asked to implement, to look at 2 empty plinths and not push until he got an answer? What could cause Roboute Guilliman, perhaps the most analytically rigorous of all the Primarchs, to note the swelling of his legion's numbers in the aftermath of the Rangdan Xenocides, without pressing too hard on the question of where those additional warriors had come from? The answer, in the logic of the setting, is the Emperor. The Emperor's will is the closest thing the Great Crusade has to an absolute force. Not because the Primarchs are simply obedient, they demonstrably are not, and their histories are filled with instances of disobedience and argument and negotiation with their father, but because the Emperor, at his best, combines psychic authority of a genuinely extraordinary scale with a demonstrated record of judgment that has, over the long arc of history, been proven correct often enough to command deference even from beings capable of challenging it. When the Emperor says this is not to be discussed, and when the Sigillite adds his own formidable psychic weight to that instruction, and when the custodian guard stands ready to enforce the instruction with the kind of violence that can threaten even Primarchs, the result is a silence that holds even among beings who might otherwise refuse to be silenced. The plinths remain empty, the archives remain expunged, and the mystery grows, year by year, decade by decade, millennium by millennium, becoming something that even the Imperium's own historians of the 41st millennium must acknowledge without being able to explain. Part 2. Born of the Emperor's Dream, the Primarch Project, and the scale of what was lost. To understand why losing 2 entire legions is not merely a military disaster, but something that approaches a civilizational wound, you need to spend time with the creation of the Primarchs and the early development of the legions, because the cost of building these things was so extraordinary that the very concept of simply removing them from the equation is nearly incomprehensible. Picture Terra in the late 29th and early 30th millennia. It is not the holy, fortress-shrouded world of the far future, with its continental hive cities, and its perpetual shroud of pollution, and its billions of pilgrims pressing toward the light of the Astronomicon. It is something rawer and grimmer than that. A world that has been through the age of strife, through centuries of techno-barbarian warfare, through social collapse and ecological devastation, and the kind of long-term chaos that leaves deep scars on every institution that manages to survive it. The Emperor is pulling this world together, imposing order on warring factions through a combination of political genius and military force and psychic power of a scope that the barons and warlords who oppose him simply cannot match. He is doing this not as an end in itself, but as a foundation, because he knows that everything he is building, every piece of the infrastructure of the reunified humanity he envisions, must begin with a stable and controlled homeworld. At the same time, he is building the Space Marines. Not the fully realized, gene seed-bearing legions they will eventually become, but the foundations of them working out the biological procedures, testing the genetic templates, developing the training protocols, recruiting and transforming the first generations of warriors in processes that are expensive and time-consuming and sometimes fatal and always irreplaceable. The early legions are small and imperfect by the standards of what they will eventually grow into, but they are already formidable beyond anything human civilization has previously produced in terms of individual warrior capability. And then he builds the Primarchs. The Primarch Project is described in the lore as the most complex and ambitious genetic engineering undertaking in human history. Not one template, but 20, each one designed with specific capabilities and qualities in mind, each one the product of not just biological engineering, but something that sits at the intersection of genetics and psychic science and philosophy, the Emperor essentially deciding, with each Primarch, he creates what kind of extraordinary being is required for a specific role in the project of human reunification. The resulting individuals are not simply bigger, stronger, faster versions of Space Marines. They are qualitatively different creatures, beings whose relationship to the warp, whose psychic presence, whose intellectual and creative capabilities exist at a level that the Space Marines beneath them can admire, but not approximate. The creation of each Primarch involves the Emperor working at the absolute limits of his capability, and the Emperor's capability is itself something that the lore treats as essentially without meaningful ceiling in the context of human achievement. When he says the Primarch Project represents his finest work, he is not using hyperbole in any ordinary sense. He is describing the single greatest act of biological creation that any being within the human sphere has ever performed, or is likely ever to perform. And then the Chaos Gods intervene. The Primarchs are taken from their gene vaults while they are still in their developmental capsules, still growing, still in the process of becoming the beings they were engineered to be. The warp tears open within the most secure facility on Terra, in a place the Emperor has surrounded with every psychic and technological protection he can devise, and the capsules are stolen. They are scattered across the galaxy through a warp event of extraordinary scale, each one arriving on a different world, each one growing to maturity in an environment that the Emperor never chose and could not control. The implications of this scattering are enormous and reach into every corner of the mythology that follows. Each Primarch is shaped by their world of upbringing in ways that their genetic template alone cannot predict or determine. Angron is found in a gladiatorial nightmare, enslaved and fighting for his life with neural implants in his brain designed to make him more violent and less capable of empathy. Conrad Kurze grows up on a world of perpetual darkness, surviving by understanding and ultimately embodying the predatory mechanics of fear. Rogel Dorn comes from a world that values stoicism and endurance above all else. Magnus develops his psychic gifts in a culture that reveres knowledge without adequate frameworks for containing or controlling it. Each Primarch comes to the Great Crusade already formed, already carrying a psychological architecture that the Emperor did not design and cannot simply overwrite. This is one of the deep structural tragedies of the whole heresy narrative. The Emperor planned to raise his sons in a controlled environment where he could shape their development alongside their gifts, and he lost that opportunity before it began, and he may never have fully reckoned with what that loss meant for what his sons would eventually become. The legions that grow around each Primarch's return template are not simply military units that happen to share his genetics. They are cultural products of their Primarch's nature and their own accumulated history. The warriors of each legion carry not just the genetic legacy of their Primarch, but the lived institutional experience of decades of service, the accumulated wisdom and prejudice and mythology and collective trauma that any organization develops over a long enough existence. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the oldest legions are centuries old, with a depth of institutional culture that is genuinely difficult to compare to anything in the human experience outside of religions. You cannot simply take one of these institutions and fold it quietly into another without residue. You cannot erase the memory of hundreds of thousands of warriors who were trained in particular ways, who held particular values, who sang particular battle hymns and wore particular heraldry and fought using particular tactical doctrines without leaving traces. Even if you wipe the explicit memories, and Malcador's account suggests that some form of memory modification was applied to the surviving warriors of the lost legions, you cannot wipe the way they move, the way they think in combat, the reflexes and instincts and habits of mind that were built into them through years of training under a specific legion's methodology. The survivors of the 2nd and 11th were folded into other legions, their explicit identities erased, their origins classified, but they carried their history in their bodies. They carried it in the way they held their weapons and the angles from which they preferred to attack and the organizational instincts that fired when they assessed a battlefield. The erasure of memory is not an erasure of everything that memory was built upon. The body remembers what the mind is not permitted to recall. All of this makes the loss of 2 legions, and particularly the loss of 2 Primarchs, something that the Emperor cannot simply absorb and move past without cost. The cost is permanent. It is measured in the permanent absence of 2 unique genetic templates that cannot be replicated, 2 unique cultural institutions that cannot be rebuilt, 2 unique individual beings whose particular combination of capabilities and personality no subsequent development can reproduce. The Emperor made 20 Primarchs. He lost 2. Those 2 are gone in a way that nothing can compensate for, no matter how effectively the remaining 18 fulfill their roles. Which brings us back to the central question. The cost of building these legions was so extraordinary, and the Emperor's understanding of that cost so thorough, that the decision to remove 2 of them from history must have been made under conditions of extreme necessity. The Emperor does not waste his most valuable resources carelessly. He endures enormous transgression from his sons before taking decisive action. Angron's massacres, the Night Lord's systematic terrorism, the Word-Bearer's religious cultism, all of these are tolerated rather than terminated. For the 2nd and the 11th to receive a response so much more extreme than anything that had been applied to these other delinquent forces, whatever they did must have been categorically different in kind from anything the other legions were doing. Not just worse, different. A different kind of wrong, operating on a different level. Part 3. The Forgotten Names. What we actually know about the 2nd Legion. Let us now move from the theoretical to the evidentiary. Because for all the uncertainty surrounding the lost legions, there are actual fragments of information that survive the erasure, slip through the cracks, or were deliberately left as breadcrumbs by writers who wanted to honor the mystery without entirely eliminating it. The fragments relating to the Second Legion are small, but they are not nothing. The first and most important piece of evidence is a simple fact about the second Primarch's presence within the Brotherhood. He was there. He was known to his brothers. He was not a ghost, even in his own time. He was acknowledged, named among the roster of the Emperor's sons, and apparently had relationships with at least some of his fellow Primarchs that were personal and remembered even after his erasure. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's children, makes reference in the novel Fulgrim, the Palatine Phoenix, to his quiet brother, specifically identifying this individual as the Master of the Second. That phrase, the Master of the Second, is enormously significant because it establishes beyond doubt that the Second Legion had a Primarch who held active leadership of it for a meaningful period. He was not a theoretical entity, not a Primarch who died before reaching his legion, not something that exists only as a possibility. He was the Master of the Second. He commanded, he led, and Fulgrim remembered him as quiet. This is an interesting characterization in a brotherhood not lacking for individuals who command attention. Horus is luminous and socially magnetic, drawing people to him almost against their will. Lorgar is passionate and intensely communicative about whatever he believes in with the fervor of a true believer. Angron is violence made incarnate, impossible to ignore under any circumstances. Magnus is brilliant and voluble and generous with his considerable knowledge. Against this backdrop, a Primarch remembered as quiet stands out precisely because quietness is such a relatively rare quality in that context. It suggests a being who communicated through action rather than speech, who did not feel the need to fill silences with words, who perhaps had a more inward-looking quality than most of his brothers. Other fragments, gathered from various sources and fan analyses of multiple Horus heresy texts, suggest that the second Primarch was skilled with a blade at a level that even his brothers noted. In the Brotherhood of Primarchs, where every individual is the greatest warrior humanity can produce, being specifically remembered as good with a blade suggests a degree of bladecraft that goes beyond baseline Primarch capability. Something specifically cultivated, specifically prioritized, suggesting an individual who found expression in the personal discipline of melee combat, rather than in the larger-scale strategic or political arenas where some of his brothers were most comfortable. He was also, apparently, found early. The theory that the second Primarch was among the first recovered and was present during the campaigns of the Crusades' early decades, alongside the first 6 or so Primarchs to be discovered, is supported by several contextual details in the lore. If he was fighting alongside Horus and the Lion and Sanguinius during some of the Great Crusades' formative campaigns, then he had decades of service before whatever ended his story. He was not a late addition, peripheral and under-integrated. He was part of the core of the Brotherhood during its most formative period. Then there is the question of the Rangdan Xenocides, and the document that should never have been accessible to ordinary Imperial soldiers in the 41st millennium. The Crusade Field Guide, an internal military document from the era of the Xenocides, found its way into copies of the Astra Militarum's standard issue uplifting primer through what the lore describes as an administrative error, a clerical mistake that let suppressed historical data slip through the censorship that was supposed to contain it. This document explicitly lists both the 2nd and the 11th Legions as having been deployed alongside Solar Auxilia forces against the Rangda aliens during the campaigns of the Xenocides, which are dated to approximately the 862nd to 890th years of the 30th millennium. This single accidental document slip is one of the most significant pieces of evidence we have. It tells us not just that the 2nd and 11th existed, but that they were present in a specific historical theater, engaged in a specific set of campaigns that the lore treats as perhaps the most catastrophic and psychologically damaging wars the Imperium fought before the heresy. It tells us that these legions were operational at a relatively late point in the Crusades' duration, since the Xenocides occur considerably after the earliest decades of the campaign, and it tells us that whatever happened to them was connected, in some way, to or following the Xenocides, because it is after the conclusion of the Xenocides that the historical record of the 2nd and 11th goes completely dark. The timing of the disappearance matters enormously. If the 2nd and 11th had been removed from the historical record earlier in the Crusades' first century, say, or before the major campaigns of the Middle Period, then their absence would be long established by the time the Xenocides begin, and there would be no reason to include them in Xenocides-era documents at all. The fact that a document from the Xenocides period references them means they were still active, still acknowledged, still part of the imperial military structure during those campaigns. Their removal from history came later. It came after something that happened in, during, or immediately following the most terrible wars of the Great Crusade. The convergence of these timelines is not something that lore-careful writers would place accidentally. The overlap between the Xenocides and the disappearance of the 2nd and 11th is deliberate, and it is probably the most significant structural clue the writers have given us about what actually happened. We also know something about the fate of the Legion's rank-and-file warriors, which we touched on earlier, but which deserves more development here. Malcador's testimony in the chamber at the end of memory, filtered through Dorn's angry resistance to the decision being made, establishes that the warriors of the Lost Legions were not executed. They were preserved. Their memories were modified. Their identities effectively erased at the level of personal history and Legion affiliation, and they were integrated into other organizations within the Imperium's military structure. Malcador characterizes this treatment of the rank and file as an act of mercy, which implies that the alternative being considered was more severe, that there were voices arguing for complete elimination of the Legion's gene seed line, and that the decision to modify and integrate rather than destroy represented a more generous outcome than the harshest position being advocated. Dorn's resistance to this is revealing. He describes himself as unwilling to be responsible for the erasure of a Legion's name from Imperial history, and he is specifically described as wanting to avoid a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the Hegemon as a Legion's only memorial. Third, he says, third. He is counting the empty plinths, and he is clear that 2 already exist, and he is refusing to participate in creating a third. The emotion in that refusal is significant. Dorn is not typically given to emotional displays. He is the Primarch most associated with stoicism, with the endurance of hardship without complaint, with the subordination of personal feeling to duty and necessity. When he refuses something with language that invokes the imagery of memorial and the weight of erasure, he is expressing genuine feeling about something that has affected him. The empty plinths of the 2nd and the 11th are not abstractions to him. They represent something real, something painful, something that he carries as a kind of grief, even if the specific story behind them is not one he fully knows or is permitted to discuss. This grief, this evident feeling of loss from beings who are largely unknown to the broader world and who have been officially declared non-existent, is perhaps the most humanizing detail in the entire mystery. It tells us that the Lost Legions were not simply forgotten, they were mourned in secret by the people who had known them. The loss was not administrative, it was personal. Part 4. The 11th and the Ghost in the Gene Vault. The 11th Legion and its Primarch are, if anything, even more elusive than the 2nd. The fragments we have are fewer, and the picture they paint is darker, not in the sense of being more evil, but in the sense of being sadder, more melancholy, centered on a being whose story seems to be defined by a failure to reach potential rather than by a catastrophic act of will. The most vivid and disturbing piece of evidence we have comes from the novel False Gods by Graham McNeill. Horus, wounded by the chaos-corrupted blade called the Anatheme on the moon of Davin, lies near death. A chaos cult uses the opportunity to drag his soul into a warp vision designed to tip him toward betrayal of the Emperor. In this vision, Horus finds himself in the Gene Vault beneath Terra, seeing the incubation capsules of his brothers as they were before the Chaos Gods, scattered them before any of them had been taken, before any of them had grown, before any of them had experienced the worlds that would shape who they became. He moves through this vision space and eventually reaches the capsule marked with the Roman numeral for 11. He stops there. The text records his perception of this moment with a quality of sadness that is precise and controlled. He feels from the capsule a sense of untapped glories, a word choice that is deliberately evocative of something that could have been magnificent, that perhaps was on the way to something magnificent and then was not. He feels not the completed greatness of what the 11th Primarch became, but the potential of what the 11th Primarch might have been, might have grown into, if things had gone differently. And alongside that sense of potential, he feels the knowledge immediate and certain, the kind of knowledge that warp visions sometimes grant with cruel directness, that those potential glories would never come to pass. Something went wrong, not at the level of corruption, not at the level of betrayal, but at a more fundamental level. The 11th Primarch was not simply prevented from being great. He was, in some way, constitutionally unable to be great, damaged, or flawed, in a way that meant his potential could never be realized. The glories that lay within that capsule were real potential, genetically present, waiting to emerge, and they never did. Horus, overwhelmed by some emotion, the text leaves deliberately ambiguous grief, perhaps, or frustration at the waste, or something the chaos vision is feeding him that mimics those emotions, strikes the capsule. He damages it slightly. Whether this action had any physical consequences in the real world, whether the vision was operating on real material reality, rather than simply showing him a reflection of it, is one of the lore's genuinely open questions. The text does not resolve it. The Gal Vorbak, the Word-Bearer's warriors, who had already begun the process of becoming the first true daemon hosts, experienced a similar vision, and one of them, a warrior named Zaffin, approached that same capsule. He observed that the 11th Primarch within was still innocent, still pure, still unformed. Another Gal Vorbak warrior, Argel Tal, looking at the capsule, thought that killing whatever was inside might prevent a shameful future. That word, shameful, lands with particular force, because Argel Tal is a being who is in the process of choosing chaos, who has already moved past ordinary imperial morality as a frame of reference. For him to apply the concept of shame to the 11th Primarch's fate implies something that even the ruinous powers found distasteful or embarrassing or beneath dignity in some way that they normally do not concern themselves with. Chaos does not tend to find things shameful. It tends to find them opportunities. Whatever the 11th story was, it was something that even corruption-adjacent minds judged negatively, which places it in a category that ordinary chaos corruption does not quite occupy. The Jagatai Khan passage in Chris Wraight's novel Scars adds another layer to the picture of how the surviving Primarchs process the absence of their two lost brothers. Khan, riding through the chaos of the unfolding heresy, has a moment of private reflection in which he begins to count his brothers and stops himself. The construction of the thought is precise and deliberate. He begins reaching for the word 20, the correct number if all his brothers were present, and corrects himself to 18 before finishing the word. The correction is presented not as a conscious act of memory. He does not have to think, oh yes, 2 are gone, but as something automatic, something that has become a neural reflex. This suggests that the absence of the 2nd and the 11th has been processed thoroughly enough that the Khan no longer carries it as an active wound that needs to be navigated consciously. It has become structural. The empty spaces are built into his architecture of the world. He does not need to remember to subtract 2 from 20, because his mental picture of the Brotherhood already has that subtraction incorporated. But the text still draws attention to the correction. It would have been easy to simply write that he thought about 18 brothers, without showing the beginning of the reach for 20. By showing the reach and the correction, Wright is telling us that the correction was not always automatic, that there was a time when the Khan would have thought 20 and had to remember to change it, when the wound was still fresh enough that navigating it required active cognitive effort. The time of unconscious correction implies a prior time of conscious correction implies a prior time of genuine grief. The passage in the story, The Chamber at the End of Memory, where Horus attempts to speak the name of one of the lost Primarchs in defiance of Malkador's authority, is perhaps the most tantalizing detail in the entire catalog of hints. Malkador reacts to the attempt with what the text calls the old, familiar rage, not a new anger at a new provocation, but a well-worn response to something he has had to deal with before, something about this particular subject that reliably produces in him a specific emotional register. Horus is choked off before he can complete what he is trying to say. He manages only the sounds M, Mal, Al, before the words are physically prevented from forming fully. Every careful reader of this scene has noticed that this sequence of sounds is potentially the beginning of a name. and the positioning of Malkador's furious reaction triggered specifically at the moment these sounds begin to emerge, before they can be completed, strongly implies that what Horus is attempting is speaking the name of a person, and that Malkador recognizes the beginnings of that name with the kind of immediacy that only comes from being very familiar with what it sounds like. Is this a name that begins with the sound recorded as Mal? Is it a name that Malkador has heard before, perhaps many times? Perhaps in contexts that produced exactly this kind of desperate attempt to speak it in defiance of the erasure? The lore does not confirm this interpretation. It is constructed to be ambiguous, to allow both the reading that Horus was attempting to speak a name and the reading that he was attempting to say Malkador's own name in a moment of rebellious defiance. But the placement of Malkador's reaction at exactly the moment the specific sounds form, rather than at the beginning of the attempt or at a later point in it, feels calibrated in a way that suggests the more interesting reading is intentional. The 11th Primarch may have had a name that sounded something like Mal in its opening sounds, or this may be a deliberate piece of false signal, planted to make us think that. Either way, it is something a careful reader is not meant to dismiss. Part 5. The Rangdan Genocides, the war that swallowed legions whole. No examination of the Lost Legions is complete without spending real time with the Rangdan Genocides, because these campaigns represent not just the most plausible context for what happened to the 2nd and the 11th, but one of the most chilling and under-discussed chapters in all of Great Crusade history. They are an event that the Imperium of the 41st millennium barely acknowledges, because acknowledging them would require explaining too much about what was lost in fighting them and what the victory ultimately cost. The Rangda, sometimes called the Rangdan in reference to the campaigns fought against them, are one of the most enigmatic of all Xenos threats in the 40,000 setting. We know precious little about them beyond the fact of what they did. They are described as a species of such macabre power and technological sophistication that, for a period, the Imperium genuinely could not identify a path to defeating them. Not in the sense of a difficult war requiring extraordinary sacrifice. In the sense of a situation where the tools and strategies and institutional understanding that the Imperium brought to the conflict were simply insufficient to the task, and the gap between what the Imperium could do and what would be required to win was not obviously closable. The 3 Xenocides campaigns take place across approximately 5 decades, beginning around the year 839 of the 30th millennium, and concluding around 890. The lore's assessment of what these campaigns cost is stark enough that it deserves to be quoted directly in spirit rather than in letter. The losses exceeded anything the Imperium would face until the Horus Heresy itself. Not in individual battles or on specific worlds, but across the totality of the campaign. Whole expeditionary fleets, complete naval formations capable of carrying tens of thousands of troops, supported by entire wings of escort vessels and capital ships, were destroyed with no survivors whatsoever. Planets that had been brought into compliance by the Great Crusade were laid waste, their populations extinguished, their infrastructure obliterated. Dozens of Titan legions, those massive walking weapons platforms that can individually level city blocks and collectively reshape the surface of a world, were eliminated. Not depleted, eliminated. And then there is the detail that most readers move past too quickly, because the language it is delivered in is understated relative to what it actually means. Entire Space Marine legions were lost. In the context of a crusade that is bringing worlds into compliance at a rate of dozens per year, in a setting where a single Space Marine company represents a military asset of extraordinary value that has taken years and significant resources to create and train, the loss of entire legions is not a manageable setback. It is not a heavy price that is paid for ultimate victory. It is a catastrophe at a level the setting almost never depicts, because the scale of it threatens the entire premise that the Space Marines are the Imperium's ultimate military instrument. What kind of enemy kills entire Space Marine legions? What kind of alien civilization has the capacity to not just defeat, but entirely eliminate military forces of this caliber? The hints about the Rangda's capabilities that survive in the fragmented lore suggest something that goes beyond conventional military confrontation. The references to a mind virus, to psychic contaminants capable of affecting space marine cognition, to something that operates at the level of consciousness rather than physical capability, point toward a species that was not trying to win by conventional military means. The Rangda were not simply better armed or more numerous. They were engaging on a different front entirely. They were attempting to corrupt the military and command structures of their opponent at the level of individual and collective judgment, to introduce something into the minds of their enemies that would undermine the effectiveness of the response long before the conventional military exchange could be resolved. The implications of this for the fate of the second Primarch are profound. A Primarch who encounters a species capable of operating on the level of mind and judgment faces a threat that his extraordinary physical capability cannot necessarily address. The typical Primarch response to danger, greater force, more effective strategy, personal example in combat is not obviously applicable to an enemy that is attacking through channels that bypass the physical altogether. And a Primarch who becomes even partially compromised by whatever the Rangda could do to minds might not be able to identify his own compromise from the inside. He might make decisions that feel correct, feel justified by the circumstances he is facing, and be entirely unable to recognize that the justifications themselves have been shaped by something external to his own values and judgment. This is what makes the Rangda scenario so compelling and so unsettling as a context for the Lost Legions. It removes simple moral categories. A Primarch who seeks alien assistance to fight the Rangda, or who makes contact with the Rangda on terms that violate Imperial doctrine, might be doing so because the Rangda's mind virus has altered his decision-making in ways he cannot detect. He is not a traitor in the sense of consciously choosing to betray the Emperor. He is a victim who is nevertheless unable to function as a trusted instrument of the Emperor's will because the thing that makes him trustworthy, his own uncorrupted judgment, has been compromised at a level that cannot be corrected through ordinary means. The Emperor, faced with a Primarch who has been cognitively altered by alien technology in ways that may not be reversible, who has made decisions or entered into arrangements that violate Imperial doctrine, and who cannot be fully trusted because the corruption may run deeper than any examination can reach. What does the Emperor do? He cannot simply punish a Primarch who is as much victim as perpetrator. He cannot fully trust a Primarch whose judgment may still be compromised in ways nobody can identify. He cannot rehabilitate a Primarch when the rehabilitation might leave residual contamination. And he cannot allow a compromised Primarch to continue leading a legion of hundreds of thousands of warriors whose access to that Primarch's influence runs deep. The answer, if this scenario is the correct one, is removal. Not punishment in the traditional sense, not condemnation as a traitor, but a kind of medical quarantine elevated to an institutional level, applied to a being whose condition is both the result of enemy action and a permanent threat to the security of everything the Emperor is building. The Dark Angels, under Lionel Johnson, bore the heaviest burden of the Xenocides and suffered losses they never fully publicly reckoned with. The Space Wolves were also present. 9 legions in total, according to what records survive, were involved in the defense against the Rangda at various stages. The Ultramarines grew dramatically in the aftermath of the Xenocides to become the largest of all the legions, a swelling of numbers that has always seemed disproportionate, even given their extensive recruitment territories. One persistent explanation for this growth is the absorption of the surviving warriors from the lost legions, the dispersal that Malcador described as an act of mercy, their memories erased and their bodies and gene seed integrated into the Ultramarine structure, contributing to the 13th Legion's numerical dominance without those warriors ever knowing what they were or where they had come from. This is speculation, but it is speculation with structural coherence. The timing of the Ultramarine swelling corresponds to the timing of the Lost Legion's disappearance. The mechanism described by Malcador Mindwipe and integration elsewhere is consistent with absorption into the Ultramarines, specifically because Guilliman is on record as having argued for mercy on behalf of the lost warriors. He would have had personal motivation to ensure that the warriors absorbed into his legion were treated with the dignity appropriate to loyal Space Marines who had suffered rather than betrayed. Part 6. The Edict of Obliteration. How you erase a civilization and why it never works completely. The formal mechanism by which the 2nd and 11th were removed from history has a name in both the real world and in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and understanding that name and its history adds a dimension to the mystery that pure lore analysis cannot provide. In the real world, the Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was a practice authorized by the Roman Senate that allowed them to declare a person's existence officially condemned after the fact, to remove them retroactively from the historical record, to destroy or alter monuments, to erase inscriptions, to melt down coins bearing their likeness, to effectively unmake their place in public consciousness. The practice was most commonly applied to emperors whose reigns had proven catastrophic, or whose characters had been retrospectively judged as tyrannical. Nero, Caligula, Domitian, Caracalla, Commodus, the emperors, who appear most frequently in lists of Roman villainy, are also the ones who faced the most concerted efforts at posthumous erasure. The practice had a particular visual signature that is still visible in the physical evidence that survives to the present day. Statues were altered, the face carved away, and recarved to represent a different person, sometimes a successor or a more ideologically acceptable figure. Inscriptions were chiseled out of stone so thoroughly that only the shape of the letter's absence remains, the stone slightly smoother where the words used to be. Coins were overstruck, new images pressed over the old ones with just enough force to distort but not entirely eliminate the original face beneath. In the most effectively executed cases, later historians genuinely could not determine that a person had existed because the evidence had been so thoroughly altered. In the less effective cases, which is to say, most cases traces survived precisely because destroying a person's history requires the cooperation of everyone who has an interest in that history, and powerful people always have allies as well as enemies. The Warhammer 40,000 setting takes this historical practice and scales it in a way that is both more thorough and, paradoxically, more visible. An edict of obliteration applied at the imperial level, with the resources of an interstellar civilization of 1 trillion people across 1 million worlds, can theoretically reach every archive and every monument and every data slate on every inhabited planet simultaneously. The logistical capacity of that project is staggering, and yet, as the Survival of the Crusade Field Guide demonstrates, the practice is still imperfect. Information hides in misfiled documents and in the memories of beings who outlived the political will to maintain the erasure, and in the oral traditions of cultures that were not fully integrated into the imperial administrative structure. In the 40,000 setting specifically, the Edict of Obliteration, the High Gothic phrase damnatio memoriae, appears in the lore with appropriate pomp, is described as the most severe, non-lethal punishment available within the imperial system. And it is important to note that it is officially non-lethal, at least at the institutional level. The edict is about removing from the record, not about executing. It is possible to declare someone excommunicate traitoris outside the law, subject to summary execution without declaring an edict of obliteration. And it is possible to declare an edict of obliteration without necessarily executing those against whom it is directed. The traitor legions of the Horus heresy received the excommunicate traitoris designation. They were named as traitors, their sins recorded in sealed documents that remain accessible to those with sufficient clearance, their primarchs listed in the black books of the Inquisition as known threats. They were not forgotten. They were remembered as enemies, which is a different thing entirely from being forgotten. The 2nd and the 11th received something more extreme. Their designation is not traitor. Their designation is expunged. The difference is the difference between a condemned criminal whose name appears in court records alongside a description of their crimes, and a person who was retroactively removed from the census as if they had never been born. One is punishment that uses memory as its instrument. The other is a punishment that destroys memory as its mechanism. Why would the authorities choose the second type of punishment over the first? The traitor legions are listed as traitors in part because their status as traitors serves a purpose. It warns people, it categorizes the threat, it provides a framework for understanding what happened to them and why they fight as they do. The warning requires memory of the thing being warned against. The decision to use the more extreme form of erasure for the 2nd and 11th implies a judgment that whatever they did cannot safely serve as a warning. that the specific details of their fate, if known, would not function primarily as a deterrent, but as something else, a destabilizing revelation, an embarrassment that undermines foundational myths, a piece of information that gives enemies or internal dissidents something to work with. The information is more dangerous than the warning it might provide is valuable. And in a civilization built as thoroughly on carefully managed mythology as the Imperium of man is, information that threatens foundational myths can genuinely be more dangerous than military threats. The Imperium functions on faith, faith in the Emperor, faith in the Primarchs as his perfect instruments, faith in the Great Crusade as an unstoppable expression of human destiny. A story that fundamentally complicates any of those faiths is not just politically inconvenient. It is, in the logic of the setting, genuinely threatening to the social cohesion of an empire held together by belief as much as by force. Whatever the 2nd and the 11th did, it is the kind of story that the Imperium cannot afford to tell. Part 7. Malcador's Secret. The Sigillite who keeps the archive. Among all the characters who move through the mythology of the Horus Heresy, Malcador the Sigillite stands apart in a specific and significant way. He is the custodian. He is the keeper of the things that cannot be widely known. He is the Emperor's oldest advisor and closest confidant, a being whose relationship with his master predates the Great Crusade by centuries, who was present at the beginning of the Emperor's rise and who has watched everything that followed with the patient attention of someone who has outlived the short perspectives that most beings operate within. Malcador is a perpetual being who cannot die in any ordinary way. His biological continuity, maintained through psychic means that are barely described and never fully explained in the available sources. He has been alive for so long that most human civilizations have risen and fallen within the span of his memory. He has watched the fall of ancient empires and the rise of new ones. He has seen technologies developed and lost and redeveloped. He has, in all likelihood, forgotten more about the history of humanity than any archive currently preserves. He is also, crucially, someone who has thought deeply and continuously about the relationship between truth and power. He believes, in a way that is evident throughout his portrayal in the Horus Heresy series, that truth is not simply a value to be maximized. That information is a tool, and like all tools, its value depends on who is wielding it and for what purpose. He is not a simple liar, he does not fabricate, but he is a keeper of selective truths, a being who has decided which true things are safe to be known and which true things, if widely distributed, would cause more harm than the cost of suppressing them is worth. This makes him, in certain respects, the ideal person to be entrusted with the secret of the lost legions. He can be trusted to keep the secret not because he lacks the moral complexity to question it, but because he has thought through the moral complexity more thoroughly than anyone else is likely to. He has weighed the costs of suppression against the costs of revelation, and he has concluded, with the kind of confidence that comes from millennia of watching what happens when secrets are prematurely exposed, that suppression is the correct answer. The audiobook The Sigillite gives us the image of Malcador standing before the ancient door to the original Gene Vault, the door covered in the heraldic symbols of the various legions, 2 of which have been scratched out. He brings his agent Caleb here, not accidentally, but with the deliberate intention of having Caleb see what is there without being able to ask about it in any way that Malcador will answer. He is not trying to share the secret. He is demonstrating that the secret exists. The distinction matters. He wants Caleb, and by extension the reader, to know that something is there, that the door and its scratched symbols are not random, that they point towards something real and suppressed. He does not want to explain what that something is. This is Malcador's characteristic mode with the Lost Legions, showing the shape of the secret without revealing its content, acknowledging the existence of the wound without describing how it was made. It is a psychologically interesting choice for a character who could simply refuse to engage at all, and it suggests something about his relationship to the secret. He is not entirely comfortable with the suppression, even if he has concluded it is necessary. He cannot simply walk past the evidence as if it is not there. He has to stop. He has to let someone else see that he is stopping. He has to acknowledge, even obliquely, that something enormous used to stand in the place where those scratches now mark an absence. When Dorn and Gilliman push back against the treatment of the Lost Legion's surviving warriors in the chamber at the end of Memory, Malcador hears their objections and responds by adjusting the outcome for the warriors, sparing them, authorizing memory modification and integration rather than execution. But he does not respond to the implicit demand for explanation. He does not tell them why the Primarchs could not be similarly spared or similarly integrated. He grants the mercy they are asking for at the level of the rank and file and refuses to engage with the question of what happened at the level of the leadership. This refusal is structurally identical to the scratches on the door. It acknowledges the question without answering it. It says, "I see what you are asking, and here is what I can give you, and what I cannot give you I will not discuss. Not because I have forgotten, and not because the information does not exist, but because the calculus of what happens if I answer is one I have already run and already resolved against disclosure." Malcador knows. He has always known. And in his knowing and his keeping, he is the most faithful guardian of a secret that the entire galaxy would have strong feelings about if it were ever fully exposed. Part 8. Leman Russ and the Wolves Who Hunted Brothers. The Space Wolves occupy a particular and disturbing position in the mythology of the Lost Legions, because the evidence suggests, though, it does not confirm that they were the instrument by which at least one of the lost Primarchs was brought to account. And the Space Wolves' history, as the Emperor's executioners, the force deployed when a Space Marine Legion has to be confronted by another Space Marine Legion, makes their involvement in this story feel not just probable, but structurally inevitable. Leman Russ is, in the surface mythology of the Space Wolves, a figure of uncomplicated heroism, the laughing Wolf King, the greatest warrior alive, the Primarch who drinks with his warriors and tells stories around fires and does not trouble himself overmuch with philosophy or politics. But this surface presentation, which the Space Wolves themselves cultivate as part of their institutional identity, is deliberately misleading. Russ is considerably more complex than he presents himself. He is a being who has thought carefully about duty and about the limits of obligation, who understands better than most Primarchs what it means to serve an authority without entirely surrendering personal judgment, who has confronted in his own career the hardest version of the question: what do you do when the person you serve asks you to do something that costs you personally, that requires you to become something you find uncomfortable, that puts you in the position of the executioner rather than the champion? In Dan Abnett's novel Prospero Burns, as Russ prepares to take his legion to Prospero to confront Magnus the Red and the Thousand Sons, a member of his inner circle asks about the precedent, about the fact that Space Marines will be fighting Space Marines. Russ responds that this is not unprecedented, that the Wolves have performed this kind of service before. He says it with what the text characterizes as dark humor, the slightly forced lightness of someone who has had to make a difficult truth into a joke, because the alternative is too heavy to carry in direct form. Dark humor about something you have done before, about something your legion has been called on to do before. Not once, in some ancient history so remote that the personal weight of it has faded, but in a way that is still close enough to be a relevant reference, still recent enough in whatever subjective sense matters to Russ, that he reaches for it when looking for a frame around which to place his current situation. The timeline matters here. If Russ and the Space Wolves were the instrument by which one or both of the lost Primarchs was removed from command and from history, that event would have occurred sometime after the Rangdan Xenocides. So, after approximately the 890th year of the 30th millennium and before the burning of Prospero, which occurs in approximately the 994th year. That gives us a window of roughly a century in which this most sensitive of all the Great Crusade's secrets was enacted. A century. There is something profoundly sad about the idea that for 100 years, Leman Russ carried the memory of having hunted a brother or brothers and said nothing about it to anyone who was not already part of the secret. Carried it in the dark humor that emerges at Prospero when the same kind of service is requested of him again. Carried it in whatever the Space Wolves' internal culture processed it as, given that an institution built around the celebration of heroic deeds would have to find a way to integrate an act that does not easily fit into the category of heroism. The Space Wolves did not commemorate what they did. There are no sagas about this, no carved tablets in the mead halls of Fenris recording the achievement. The saga culture of the Space Wolves, which celebrates virtually everything else the chapter and Legion have done, is silent on this particular service. That silence is itself a kind of testimony. The Wolves know how to celebrate. The things they do not celebrate are the things that do not fit the shape of celebration. Russ carried other things in silence too. His eventual departure into the Eye of Terror ostensibly to find a cure for the Emperor, but marked by a kind of personal urgency that goes beyond practical mission parameters, has always had the quality of someone who is also seeking something for themselves. Perhaps absolution, though the concept of absolution sits awkwardly in Space Wolf theology. Perhaps simply distance from the weight of particular memories. Perhaps the company of a darkness sufficient to match the one he has been carrying inside him. Part 9, Breadcrumbs in the Dark. Every clue left by Black Library. Let us now do something systematic. Because the evidence for the Lost Legions is scattered across dozens of novels and stories and audio dramas and codex entries, in a way that makes it easy to miss the coherence of the picture when you encounter the fragments. Individually, gathered together, they form something more substantial than any single piece suggests. The earliest published references establish the bones of the mystery. The original Space Marine game rules and background material from Games Workshop in the late 1980s explicitly mentions 20 legions, with 2 of them unexplained. The second edition Ultramarines Codex makes a specific, though later complicated, claim that the records of Legions 2 and 11 were deleted following the Horus Heresy, rather than before it, a dating that conflicts with the more detailed later lore, but which represents an early attempt to place the erasure in a specific temporal context. The Codex Imperialis, one of the foundational background texts for the setting, is similarly early and similarly places the erasure without explaining it. These early references establish the fact of the mystery without attempting to explain it, and their simplicity is a reflection of the era in which they were written, before the Horus Heresy had been developed as a setting in its own right, before the mechanisms of the Edict of Obliteration had been given their specific name and procedure, before the writers had decided in any detail what hints they were willing to give. The Horus Heresy novel series, beginning with Horus Rising in 2006, represents a massive escalation in the depth and specificity of the hints available. Horus Rising itself establishes the tone by briefly noting the absence of the 2 legions, without explaining it, treating the fact of their absence as something the characters in the story take for granted, the way you treat any well-established historical fact that you do not need to explain to your audience, because your audience already knows it. This treatment is itself significant because it tells us that by the time of the Great Crusade's middle period, the absence of the 2nd and 11th was already normalized enough that it required no explanation in casual references. The Lightning Tower by Dan Abnett gives us the Dorn scene at the empty plinths, which we have discussed extensively, and it is one of the most emotionally effective pieces of evidence in the entire collection, precisely because it approaches the mystery from the angle of its emotional weight rather than its informational content. Dorn is not trying to explain the empty plinths. He is feeling them. His response to them in the context of thinking about the impossibility of Primarch betrayal tells us something about the emotional valence of the Lost Legions in the surviving Primarchs' internal lives, not just an intellectual fact but an emotional reality, something felt rather than merely known. False Gods by Graham McNeill, as already discussed at length, gives us the Gene Vault vision and the 11th Primarch's capsule. This scene is arguably the most explicit piece of evidence for the 11th's character and fate available in any widely accessible source, and its positioning early in the second novel of the series, before Horus has fully fallen, at a moment when he can still feel something like grief for a lost brother, is deliberate. We are meant to encounter the mystery of the 11th at a moment when one of the setting's central characters is experiencing it with us, feeling the loss fresh, even if the loss itself is decades old. 1,000 Suns by Graham McNeill contains a prophecy delivered by a character called Callista Eris that references the Blood Ravens, with imagery connecting them to lost sons and a raven of blood, which fans have long associated with the Lost Legion's survivors and their potential connection to later chapters. The prophecy is elliptical. All prophecy in the Warhammer setting tends to be but the specific imagery of lost sons seeking salvation and knowledge that is denied, resonates with the narrative of warriors who were mind-wiped and reintegrated without access to their own history. Prospero Burns, by Dan Abnett, delivers the Russ reference discussed at length in the previous section. It also contains other material touching on the mechanisms of imperial censure and the role of the Space Wolves as the Emperor's executioners that contextualizes the Russ comment and makes its implications more legible. Descent of Angels by Mitchell Scanlon gives us the timeline establishing detail that in the 800s of the 30th millennium, Lyon L. Johnson is described as having 19 brothers, a number that implies the 2nd and the 11th were still present and counted among the Primarch Brotherhood at that point. This is crucial for establishing that the erasure had not yet occurred during the Crusades' early to middle period and must have happened in the later part of the campaign. The Sigillite audiobook gives us Malcador and the scratched-out symbols. The Chamber at the End of Memory gives us Dorn and Guilliman's advocacy and Malcador's response. The Primarch's anthology novella, Feet of Iron, provides contextual information about the broader Great Crusade era that helps place the Lost Legion's probable campaigns. The Inferno supplement for the Horus Heresy game gives us the Rangdan Xenocides in their most detailed published form, with explicit mention of the 2 unknown legions fighting alongside Solar Auxilia. And then there is the Regimental Standard, a real-world, in-universe publication that Games Workshop produces as a piece of humor marketing, styled as an actual Imperial soldier's information pamphlet that contained a reference to the Rangdan Xenocides in a way that mentioned the unknown legions. This was reportedly an intentional Easter egg from the writers, slipped into a format where it would be visible to observant readers without being officially part of the established lore, in a way that would create continuity obligations. What does all of this add up to? It adds up to a coordinated effort across dozens of writers spanning almost 2 decades of the Horus Heresy series to ensure that the mystery is enriched without being resolved. Each writer who touches on the topic adds substance, a texture, a piece of emotional evidence, a temporal marker, a character's reaction without adding the specific factual content that would close the question down. This level of coordination across a publication program of this scale represents a genuine collective creative commitment to the idea that some mysteries serve the story better unresolved. Part 10. The Blood Ravens and Other Shadows. What survived the erasure? The question of what happened to the warriors who survived the fate of their Primarchs is one that the lore addresses partially, but never fully. We know, from Malcador's testimony, that they were not executed. We know they were mind-modified and dispersed. And we have, in the 41st millennium, organizations whose mysterious origins may reflect this dispersal shadows of the lost. Legions that exist in the setting in a different form, carrying the genetic legacy and some of the cultural imprint of their origin without knowing that they do. The Blood Ravens are the most prominent of these potential survivors. This is a Space Marine chapter that is, in the full context of Warhammer 40,000, deeply unusual for a reason that goes beyond their tactical doctrines or their aesthetic choices. They do not know who they are. At a fundamental institutional level, the level of genetic identity that is, in this setting, the most basic form of organizational identity available, the Blood Ravens are unknowing. Every Space Marine chapter derives its gene seed from one of the original 20 legions. This derivation is not merely historical. It is biological, manifesting in specific ways in how the gene seed organs develop and function, creating subtle but detectable differences between gene seed derived from different Primarchs. The Mechanicus maintains records of these biological signatures and can, in principle, determine any chapter's lineage from a gene seed sample. For the Blood Ravens, attempts to do this have been described in various sources as having produced inconclusive or deliberately obstructed results. The trail leads somewhere and then stops, as if the next data point in the chain has been removed. Their internal records, similarly, go dark before the 37th millennium. Everything before that point is absent, not lost in the chaos of some local disaster, not corrupted by data decay, but simply missing in a way that looks institutional rather than accidental. The records that should document their founding, their primogenitor legion, their early history, are not there. And the Inquisition, which does have records of the Blood Ravens, has classified those records at a level that the chapter itself cannot access. This is not how chapter founding normally works. Chapters know where they come from. They know which of the original legions they are descended from, and they trace their gene seed lineage with the same care and reverence that the Adeptus Mechanicus applies to technological knowledge. The Blood Raven's ignorance of their own genetic heritage is not the default condition of a Space Marine chapter. It is an imposed condition, maintained by the same institutional infrastructure that maintains the erasure of the 2nd and the 11th. The Blood Raven's culture offers additional evidence. They are a chapter obsessed with the acquisition of knowledge, a trait they have in abundance compared to virtually all other chapters. They field a disproportionately large number of librarian psychers, whose training and capabilities exceed the norm even for chapter librarians, who are already the most psychically gifted warriors in a given chapter's roster. They are drawn to ancient lore and lost technologies in a way that seems to go beyond strategic calculation, operating more like a compulsion. Their battle hymns and litanies speak of seeking and discovering and recovering what was lost, a thematic orientation that is unusual in a military culture that would normally prioritize destruction of the enemy over recovery of the past. These are the hallmarks, if not identical then strongly resembling, the culture of a legion that was built around the pursuit of arcane knowledge through psychic means. A legion that produced an extraordinary proportion of psychically gifted warriors. A legion whose primarch was perhaps the most powerful and knowledgeable psyker in a brotherhood of demigods. The Thousand Sons. The prevailing theory among serious lore analysts is that the Blood Ravens are descended from survivors of the Thousand Sons, specifically from those members of Magnus's legion who maintained their loyalty to the Imperium when their primarch dragged most of the legion toward chaos, who could not follow their brothers into the Eye of Terror, and could not simply walk back into the Imperium, carrying gene seed marked with the genetic signature of a declared traitor legion. These warriors would have needed to disappear, to have their origins obscured, to present themselves to the Imperium as something other than what their genes declared them to be. Whether this is the correct answer or not, the Blood Ravens demonstrate something important about how the Lost Legion's problem might have been managed. The mechanism exists. The institutional capacity to erase organizational origins, to reclassify gene seed lineage, to create a chapter that does not know who its ancestors were, is a real capability within the Imperial administrative structure. If it was done with the Blood Ravens, for whatever reason, then the same mechanism could have been applied to the survivors of the 2nd and the 11th with equal effectiveness and similar results. Chapter-level organizations that carry the genetic legacy of their lost ancestors without knowing it, their identities shaped by an inheritance they cannot access. Somewhere in the 41st millennium, warriors descended from the 2nd and the 11th March under banners they cannot connect to their true history. They carry in their gene seed the legacy of beings whose names the Imperium has officially unmade. They wear heraldry that belongs to a chapter founded in the aftermath of an erasure and told to look forward rather than back. And they are, in a deeply melancholy sense, monuments to the possibility that history destroyed is never completely destroyed, that it persists in the biological inheritance of those who carry the blood forward, even when the mind has been convinced that the blood comes from somewhere else. Part 11. Why Games Workshop will never solve this. Rick Priestley's confession and the power of mystery. The man who created the Lost Legions has explained, in multiple discussions with fans over the years, exactly why he created them and what he intended them to be. And his explanation resolves the question of whether this mystery was ever supposed to have an answer with admirable directness. No, it was not. Rick Priestley, who co-created Warhammer 40,000 and who wrote much of the original Horus Heresy background material during his time at Games Workshop in the 1980s, created the Unknown Legions to provide what he called deep background, unknowable mysteries, things that beg questions for which there could be no answer. He wanted the distant history of the setting to function like genuine mythology, not the kind of carefully documented history that can be fully reconstructed by a sufficiently diligent scholar, but the kind of mythological past that ancient cultures believed in and related to through story and symbol, without ever expecting to fully understand in any analytical sense. His precise words, shared in comments that circulated through the Warhammer fan community, express a mild and completely understandable frustration with what subsequently happened to his creation. He built mysteries intended to be inaccessible. He built them to be the dark at the edge of the lamplight, the place where imagination is most active because evidence is least constraining. And then the Horus Heresy was developed as a detailed fictional setting in its own right, placing dozens of novels and stories in exactly the historical period where the mysteries lived, creating enormous pressure to explain things that were designed to be inexplicable. To the considerable credit of the writers who have worked on the Heresy series, they have navigated this pressure with remarkable skill. They have added texture and emotional depth and contextual richness to the mystery, without collapsing it into an answer. They have given us the Gene Vault vision and the scratched-out symbols and the dark humor of Russ and the empty plinths that Dorn studies with grief. They have made the mystery feel more inhabited, more emotionally real, more connected to the living history of the setting. But they have not, despite having 60-plus novels in which to do it, given us the answer. This is not an accident. It is a commitment. It is a decision made at the level of the creative direction of a publishing program to honor the original intent of the setting's creator, even as that setting is being elaborated far beyond what its creator originally envisioned. When fans told Priestley that they assumed the Lost Legions were created to give players creative space-convenient gaps in the canonical structure, where homebrew armies could be inserted without contradicting established lore, he pushed back. He had, after all, already built that kind of space into the setting explicitly, in the form of hundreds of undescribed Space Marine chapters, whose slots were deliberately left open for player creativity. The Lost Legions were not that kind of blank. They were not an invitation to fill, they were an invitation to wonder. The historical precedent Priestley was drawing on is one that resonates precisely because it is real. The Lost Legions of Rome, the most famous of which is the Legio Nona Hispana, the Ninth Legion, which disappears from Roman historical records sometime in the 2nd century of the Common Era, have the same quality of productive mystery that Priestley was trying to recreate. The Ninth Legion was stationed in Britain. It vanished from the record. Scholars have debated for centuries what happened to it, with theories ranging from destruction in Caledonia to transfer to the Eastern Empire, and the honest answer remains that the evidence is genuinely insufficient for certainty. What is certain is that the uncertainty has inspired extraordinary creative and intellectual engagement over many centuries. The novel The Eagle of the Ninth, Rosemary Sutcliffe's story of a young Roman officer searching for his father's Lost Legion's Eagle standard, has never gone out of print since its publication in 1954. Films have been made about the mystery. Academic papers continue to be written. The mystery has a durability that no solved historical question can match, because solving a question spends its generative energy while an unsolvable mystery accumulates it. Priestley wanted that quality for Warhammer 40,000. He wanted a mystery that could generate engagement indefinitely because it could not be definitively resolved. And in the specific form of the 2nd and 11th Legions, he found an ideal vehicle for that quality, not just a historical gap, but a historical gap built into the mythology of a setting that thousands of people engage with creatively, that hundreds of writers continue to elaborate, that millions of fans continue to discuss. The mystery does not decrease with engagement. It deepens. Games Workshop has, periodically, faced pressure from portions of the fan community to reveal the truth about the Lost Legions, to write the novel that explains it all, to publish the Codex entry that finally names the Primarchs and describes what happened to their forces. The pressure comes from a completely understandable place, the same curiosity that makes people read detective novels and watch mystery films and spend hours on internet forums discussing theories. The desire for resolution is real and legitimate, but the resolution would cost more than it would give. A resolved mystery becomes historical fact. It can be appreciated, but it stops generating the kind of active engagement that an unresolved mystery sustains. The moment you name the second Primarch, everyone who had a different name in their homebrew stops having a conversation with the canon and starts having a conflict with it. The moment you explain exactly what happened in the final Rangdan Xenocide, the Space Wolf patrol that went to confront a lost brother, the moment of decision that the Emperor made from his throne, all of that becomes fixed, immovable. And the imagination, which was free to place anything in that space, discovers that the space has been occupied by something that may or may not be what it would have chosen. The empty plinth is more generative than any statue could be, because the empty plinth can become whatever the viewer is capable of imagining in that space. And the viewers of this particular mystery have demonstrated, over 30+ years, and in the creative output of an enormous community, that they are capable of imagining extraordinary things. Part 12. The Mystery That Makes 40,000 Great. A Final Reflection. There is something the Lost Legions teach us about the nature of the Warhammer 40,000 setting that no amount of lore analysis about specific battles or specific characters can quite articulate. Something about why this hobby endures the way it does, why the setting has sustained passionate engagement across generations when so many fictional universes that were its contemporaries have faded or ossified. The 40,000 universe is, by any reasonable measure, overwhelmingly large. It is a setting of such elaborate detail that a person could spend years studying nothing but the history of a single chapter, or a single alien race, or a single pivotal campaign, and still not exhaust the available material. The Horus Heresy alone has produced over 60 novels plus dozens of shorter works across nearly 2 decades of continuous publication, and it addresses only a few decades out of 10,000 years of documented history. The setting is built to reward obsession, to repay every hour of study with more questions that deserve more hours of study. And yet, in this universe of overwhelming specificity, of documented battles and named characters, and precisely described biological processes, and elaborately constructed political structures, the thing that keeps people most deeply engaged is not the certainty of the world, but its uncertainty. It is the places where the detail stops, the corners where the lamp does not quite reach, the questions that accumulate rather than resolve the more you study the setting. The Lost Legions are the purest expression of this principle. They represent not a gap in an otherwise complete record, but a deliberate absence at the heart of the most mythologically significant event in the setting's history. They are a void shaped like 2 of the greatest military institutions the human race has ever created, and that void is not merely present, it is visible. The empty plinths are left in place. The scratched-out symbols are left on the door. The dark humor is left in Russ's words. The grief is left in Dorn's posture. The catch is left in Jagatai's mental arithmetic. The absence is maintained with as much care as the presence is around it. A mystery with a solution, once solved, is complete. It can be appreciated, revisited, enjoyed with the particular pleasure of retroactive recognition. Ah, the clue was there all along. I see it now. But it is finished. The energy of not knowing has been spent in the moment of knowing, and what remains is a fact rather than a question. A mystery without a solution accumulates rather than spends its energy. Every new fragment of evidence, every new theory developed from existing fragments, every creative work inspired by the mystery is an investment in the question rather than a payment toward its resolution. The engagement compounds. The mystery becomes more itself, more distinctly the thing it is, the longer it remains unresolved. This is what has happened with the 2nd and the 11th. They have been open for over 30 years, and in that time, they have become something that exceeds their original intent. They are no longer just a creative device for providing mythological depth to a fictional setting. They are a community experience, a shared intellectual investment, a conversation that has been running for 3 decades and shows no sign of concluding because the question at its center cannot be conclusively answered. Every person who comes to the setting and discovers the mystery for the first time enters a conversation that has already been running for years, and their fresh perspective, and their fresh theories, and their fresh creative responses to the absence contribute something new to the ongoing engagement. The Homebrew Legions are perhaps the most vivid expression of this generativity. Across the hobby community, there are thousands of Space Marine armies built to represent someone's interpretation of what the 2nd or the 11th must have been. They wear colors that feel right for a quiet, thoughtful Primarch who was good with a blade. They bear heraldry, inspired by the imagery of loss or erasure, or redemption or damnation. They fight with doctrines imagined from the fragments available. They tell stories in army rosters and painting projects and battle reports that are as varied and inventive as the people who create them, because the canvas is genuinely blank in the way that only a truly unresolved mystery can leave it. These armies are monuments to the power of the empty plinth. They are what the imagination puts in the space that history has left open. And they are, in a quiet way, continuations of the 2nd and the 11th by other means. The warriors who march in those colors are not canonically connected to the Lost Legions, but they carry something of what the Lost Legions represent, the possibility space that was opened when 2 names were taken from the record and never returned. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods and the grinding advance of a civilization holding itself together by faith and force and the bare insistence on survival, there are also absences, silences that have weight, spaces where something enormous used to stand before it was removed in the dark. The 2nd and the 11th were real. In the logic of the setting, they fought and marched and bled and built something that may have been essential to the Great Crusade's survival. Their warriors breathed the air of alien worlds and carried the light of the Emperor into the outer dark and came back changed by what they found there. They had names, these warriors. They told jokes in their mess halls and competed in sparring matches and sang the songs of worlds they would never see again, because their legion was always moving outward, always pushing toward the next compliance, the next horizon, the next edge of the expanding imperial sphere. All of that was taken. Every name, every joke, every song, every memory, scraped from the stone of history as thoroughly as a sculptor can scrape the image from a medallion, leaving behind only the shadow of what the image once was, the faint impression in the metal where the face used to be. But shadows are not nothing, and the shape of what was removed is itself a form of information. We know something was there. We know it was vast. We know it mattered enough that erasing it was judged necessary. And we know the erasure was never quite complete, because complete erasure is impossible when the subject of the erasure was large enough and real enough to leave marks everywhere it touched. And these legions touched everything. They fought alongside the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves and the Ultramarines. They sailed on the same fleets and attended the same councils and stood at the edges of the same great decisions. Their Primarchs broke bread with Horus and sparred with Rogel Dorn, and maybe, once, stood at the edge of a map table beside the Emperor himself, and received an assignment from which they would not return unchanged. All of that experience left marks. The marks persist, faint and indirect and frustratingly incomplete, in every surviving account that touched the edge of their story. And in those marks, if you look carefully enough and read with sufficient patience and bring enough knowledge of how this universe actually works, you can see the outline of something that is trying to be remembered, even from within an official forgetting. The empty plinths are still there. In whatever dimension of the setting's reality holds the imperial palace as it existed in the 31st millennium. 2 pedestals, cut from the same stone as all the others, standing in a row of 18 occupied companions, carrying nothing. They have stood empty for 10,000 years. And in those 10,000 years, everything anyone has ever imagined about what once stood on those plinths has been, in some small and genuine way, a monument to the beings who were taken from them. We do not know who they were. We may never know. And in the not knowing, in the space between the question and the silence, where an answer should be, 30 years of imagination have been building something that no official answer could have inspired. The empty plinth is more generous than the filled one, because the filled one can only be what it is, while the empty one can be everything anyone needs it to be. That is the legion nobody knows about. Not the 2nd, not the 11th specifically, though those are the shadows and the outlines we have been tracing tonight. The legion nobody knows about is everything that has ever been placed in that space by the people who found the mystery and could not let it go. Every army painted in honor of a name that was taken. Every theory worked through in the small hours of the morning. Every homebrew Primarch given a face and a story and a reason for the thing that ended them. They belong to all of us, in the way that only a mystery can belong. And they will remain ours, for as long as there are people willing to look at the empty space where the name used to be, and imagine what might have been there. If you made it to the end of this one, I want to say thank you, genuinely. This kind of deep lore exploration takes real time to put together, and it means a lot that you are here for it. If this is the kind of content you want more of, please subscribe. There is a lot more coming, and this channel is dedicated to doing exactly this kind of thorough, patient examination of everything Warhammer 40,000 has to offer. And drop a comment. Tell me your theory. Tell me what you think the 2nd and the 11th did. Tell me what name you think was beginning to form in Horus's throat when Malkador choked it back. Tell me what army you have built in honor of a legion that the Imperium says never existed. Those comments make this worth doing, every single time. The plinths are empty. The question is alive. The conversation continues. End of script. Part 1. Continued the weight of empty pedestals. There is a secondary consideration to the empty plinths that is worth dwelling on before we move forward, because it illuminates something about the way the imperial system processes failure. The plinths in the investiary were not simply ceremonial. In the mythology of the Great Crusade, the statues of the Primarchs served a specific psychic and cultural function. They were not just representations. They were anchors of memory, physical objects, tied to the ongoing legacy of beings of enormous psychic weight, maintained as part of the broader ritual apparatus by which the Imperium managed and channeled the collective significance of its greatest military and spiritual figures. When you remove a statue from a plinth in this context, you are not simply moving a piece of carved stone. You are removing a node in a network of meaning that has been built up over decades by the worship and reverence and investment of millions of people. The loss leaves something that the remaining network has to work around, like a scar around a healed wound that always looks different from the surrounding tissue. The other statues do not simply fill the gap. The gap persists as a gap. This matters because it speaks to what the Emperor was willing to accept as the cost of the erasure. He was willing to accept a permanent disruption in the commemorative architecture of his own civilization, a visible wound in the physical fabric of his palace and in the psychic infrastructure of his project. He judged that the cost of leaving the plinths empty, the questions it would generate, the grief it would impose on those who noticed, the cognitive dissonance of seeing 18 where there should be 20, was less than the cost of pretending the absent statues had never been there at all. Which means the erasure was not trying to be perfect, it was trying to be sufficient. It was not attempting to convince the most attentive observers that nothing was missing, because those observers, people of Primarch-level intelligence and awareness, could never be convinced of that. It was attempting to prevent anyone from knowing specifically what was missing and why. The difference between knowing something is gone and knowing what it was and what happened to it is the real target of the censorship. And that, at least, seems to have been achieved. We also have to reckon with what it meant for the ordinary warriors of the remaining legions to live in proximity to those empty plinths. A Space Marine legionary who walks through the investiary of the Imperial Palace and counts the statues, and these are beings of enhanced intelligence and carefully trained observational ability. They would count. It is in their nature to count and catalog everything militarily and architecturally relevant about any space they pass through, notices the discrepancy immediately. He knows 20 legions were created. He knows only 18 statues are present. He cannot help but ask the question, and the answer he receives, from whatever authoritative source he can access, is always the same non-answer: do not ask. Those entries have been expunged. That information is not available. Return to your duties. The psychological weight of that repeated non-answer, accumulating over years and decades of service, creates a particular kind of epistemic unease that is built into the Great Crusade's military culture in a way that is very difficult to fully excise. The knowledge that something significant exists and cannot be discussed is not the same as the knowledge that nothing exists. It generates curiosity, speculation, and in some individuals genuine anxiety, the anxiety of operating within a system that you know is not telling you everything, that you know contains large hidden truths that might be relevant to your situation, that you cannot fully trust as transparent. In the longer arc of the Horus Heresy narrative, this endemic epistemic unease is arguably one of the conditions that made the heresy possible. A legion of warriors conditioned to notice contradictions and ask questions and pursue their own understanding of truth, existing within an administrative structure that repeatedly tells them large categories of things are simply not to be discussed, is a legion of warriors with a standing grievance against the management of information. The word-bearers, theological seeking, which the Emperor found so disruptive, is partly a product of this same disposition. A legion trained to pursue truth, confronting a system that had decided certain truths were too dangerous to share. The two lost legions did not cause the Horus heresy, but the kind of institutional secrecy that their erasure required and maintained is part of the same soil in which the heresy grew. Part 3. Continued, why only two? The question of why only two legions received this extreme treatment when so many others committed arguably serious transgressions without facing anything remotely similar is one of the most important questions in the analysis of this mystery, and it is one that the lore gives us enough to speculate on, even if not enough to answer definitively. Consider the full range of what the surviving legions did before and during the Horus heresy. Angron and the World Eaters massacred an entire planetary population on Genna, murdered in forms of systematic cruelty rather than in the heat of battle. This was not a secret, not something perpetrated in a remote part of the galaxy with no witnesses. It was known to the Emperor's command structure, responded to by dispatching Leman Russ to confront Angron directly, and ultimately tolerated. Angron kept his legion. Conrad Kurz of the Night Lords conducted campaigns of mass terror that included the crucifixion of thousands of civilians, the strategic deployment of atrocity as a governing tool, the systematic use of fear in ways that horrified even his fellow Primarchs. He was confronted, censured, repeatedly warned. He kept his legion. Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns performed a massive act of illegal psychic sorcery that physically disrupted the Emperor's most important and most secret project, the construction of the Webway, which the Emperor was building in secret beneath the Imperial Palace, a project that Magnus's actions tore open and destroyed, with consequences that cascaded directly into the worst of the Horus heresy. Magnus destroyed the Emperor's greatest work through an act of exactly the kind of forbidden sorcery he had explicitly prohibited. Magnus lost his world, his legion's home, and eventually his legion's sanity, but the legion itself was not erased from the record. Against this background of tolerated and at most harshly punished transgressions, the complete erasure of the second and the 11th requires an explanation that goes beyond simply doing something bad. They must have done something that was categorically different in kind from anything any of the surviving traitors did. Something that operated on a different level, that implicated different things, that left consequences or implications or ongoing risks that the usual punishments could not adequately address. The most coherent explanation that fits both the severity of the response and the specific timing in relation to the Rangdan genocides is one that involves the nature of the transgression rather than just its scale. Angron massacred a planet because he was violent, and the butcher's nails in his brain made him violent, and the Emperor had known this when he found Angron and had decided the capability outweighed the risk. This is a failure within the system, even a catastrophic failure, but it is a failure of the kind the system was built to manage. The Emperor's response to Angron is calibrated to what the system can handle: confrontation, censure, continued deployment with oversight. If the second Primarch was compromised by something external, a Xenos, mind-affecting technology, a form of psychic contamination that could theoretically be spread to others who came into close contact with him, an ideological corruption that had infected the Legion's broader command structure through exposure to their Primarch, then the system is not equipped to handle it in the same way. You cannot simply confront and censure a Primarch whose judgment itself has been compromised, because the instrument you use for confrontation is your own judgment, and if his judgment is altered, you have no reliable way to bring him back to a position where the confrontation can have its intended effect. You cannot deploy him with oversight if the nature of his compromise means that oversight by his brothers might expose them to the same contamination. You cannot retain him in any functional capacity if the contamination is such that his continued existence in the system represents an ongoing risk of spreading. This is the logic of quarantine applied at the level of demigod biology and psychic influence, and it produces, inexorably, the same outcome: removal. Not punishment for what was done, because punishment implies a return to function after the punishment is served, and there may be no return to function available. Simply removal, as completely as can be managed, because the ongoing risk of the alternative is too high. The 11th may have operated on similar logic, but through a different mechanism. If the 11th Primarch's fundamental issue was not corruption, but constitutional inadequacy, if the being grown in that gene capsule was flawed at a deep level, unable to function as a Primarch should function, presenting to the legion below him a kind of instability or unpredictability that undermined rather than supported their capability. Then the emperor's response might be similar in form, while different in motivation. Not an external threat requiring quarantine, but an internal failure requiring management. The result is the same. The legion cannot continue to function with this Primarch at its head, and the Primarch cannot be repurposed, and the situation cannot simply be disclosed because the disclosure would undermine the mythology of Primarch perfection that the Great Crusade's military culture depends upon. In both cases, the erasure serves a purpose that execution alone would not serve. Execution ends the life but preserves the story. The erasure ends the story, which is what is actually required. Part 12. Continued What the Mystery Builds. What we have been doing tonight is something more than lore analysis, though it is that too. We have been sitting with the experience of not knowing in a universe that usually provides answers. The 40,000 setting, for all its grimdark reputation and its genuine darkness, is fundamentally a setting that explains things. It tells you how everything works, what happened to cause the current state of affairs, who the important figures are, and what they did and why they did it. Even its most tragic and disturbing events have explanations, motivations, causes, and consequences that can be traced and understood. The Horus Heresy happened because of a combination of chaos manipulation, the Emperor's own secretiveness and failures of communication, and the flaws inherent in extraordinary beings raised under impossible conditions. We can trace every step of that, because the lore provides the materials to trace it. The Lost Legions are different. They are the place where the explaining stops. Not because the writers ran out of ideas or interest, not because the story was never worked out behind closed doors, but because it was decided by the game's creators, and then by the writers who inherited the tradition, that this particular thing should not be explained, that the not knowing was more valuable than any answer. There is a particular quality to sitting with a genuine mystery, especially one that involves something irreversible and enormous. The 2nd and 11th Legions were real, in the sense that they are real within a coherent fictional universe. They existed. They had warriors and ships and histories and Primarchs who were genuine individuals with personalities and relationships. And all of that was taken, definitively, thoroughly, in ways that cannot be undone. The erasure was permanent in the way that only the destruction of everything that records a thing can make it permanent. Sitting with that, with the genuine permanence of the loss, even within a fictional frame, produces something that is worth naming. It produces the particular quality of feeling that the best historical fiction produces when it handles real disappearances and real erasures. The feeling that you are standing at the edge of something that happened and cannot be recovered. That the gap in the record is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be mourned. The Warhammer community, perhaps more than is widely acknowledged outside it, has genuinely mourned the Lost Legions. Not in any formal or organized way, but in the quiet way that you mourn when you feel the absence of something you never knew, when the shape of the missing thing is clear enough that you can imagine what it was like without being able to verify the imagining. The armies painted in their honor, the stories written to fill the space, the arguments about what they might have been. All of this has the quality of memorial as much as entertainment. It is a community's way of refusing to let the erasure be entirely complete. And in that refusal, something genuinely beautiful has been built. The 2nd and the 11th are, paradoxically, among the most creatively generative forces in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not despite their absence, but because of it. The specific stories that have been produced in their honor, by thousands of people across 3 decades of engagement with the mystery, are more diverse and more inventive than anything a single canonical answer could have produced. The Lost Legions, by remaining lost, have become a gift to every person who needed a space in this universe that was genuinely their own, a space where their imagination was the authority, where no rulebook could override their vision, where their answer was as good as anyone else's, because no authority had provided a competing answer. The Imperium wanted to remove them from the story, and instead, by removing them from the official story, it handed them to every individual story that has ever needed them. That is not a bad outcome for a pair of armies the Emperor tried to forget. Consider also what the Lost Legions do for the broader thematic texture of the 40,000 setting. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting that takes seriously the idea that institutions fail, that systems of power lie to the people within them, that the official history is never quite the actual history. These are themes that run through the entire setting, from top to bottom: the propaganda of the Ministorum, the secrets of the Inquisition, the hidden agendas of the Mechanicus, the uncomfortable truths buried in the black library of the Harlequins. The setting is saturated with the idea that powerful organizations systematically suppress inconvenient truths, and that the surface presentation of events and people and institutions is always at least partially a construction. The Lost Legions are the purest and most extreme expression of this theme. They are not just a suppressed inconvenient truth. They are the suppression of the Imperium's own history at a foundational level. The removal of 2 of the 20 figures who collectively represent the entire project of human reunification, conducted by the Emperor himself. If even he does this, if even the figure who represents the highest aspiration of the setting engages in the systematic erasure of things he judges too dangerous to be known, then the skepticism the setting encourages toward all official accounts is justified. Everything else the Imperium claims is open to the same doubt. The empty plinths are not just a mystery, they are an argument that the official history is always partial, always constructed to serve the purposes of those who construct it, always in relationship to something that it is not saying. The missing statues teach you how to read the present statues with appreciation for what they tell you, and awareness that what they do not tell you may be as important. This is genuinely sophisticated work for what began as background flavor text in a miniatures war game from the 1980s. It is the kind of sophistication that has allowed the setting to sustain and deepen its artistic ambition across decades, accumulating layers of meaning that continue to reward engagement long after a simpler setting would have exhausted its possibilities. Rick Priestley, studying archaeology at Lancaster University before his career in game design, would have encountered the concept of absence as evidence. In archaeology, the absence of expected material evidence from a site is not simply a gap to be noted and moved past. It is data. The absence tells you something about what happened, about who made choices and what choices they made, about the forces that shaped the site and left it in the condition it was found in. The site that should contain a certain type of artifact and does not contains the fingerprint of whatever process removed or prevented that artifact. The site that should contain a certain kind of structure and does not is telling you something about why the expected structure was never built or why it was taken down. The Lost Legions are archaeology applied to fictional world building. The absence is evidence. The shape of the gap tells you something about what was there and why it was removed, even when the specific content of what was there cannot be directly recovered. And the engagement required to read absence as evidence, to sit with the not knowing long enough to understand what its specific shape implies, is exactly the kind of engagement that turns a miniatures hobby into a genuine, creative, and intellectual practice. We have been doing that work tonight. We have been sitting with the absence and reading its shape, and the shape, as best as it can be discerned through the fragments that survive the erasure, is this. Something enormous was there. Something that fought and bled and marched. Something that faced the worst the galaxy could offer in the most terrible wars of an already terrible age, and made decisions that the Emperor could not allow to stand, but also could not afford to condemn openly. Something that ended not with villainy, but with a kind of tragedy, not the tragedy of corruption or rebellion, but the tragedy of circumstances that left no good options, of beings who perhaps did the best they could with what they had, and were nevertheless found insufficient or contaminated or otherwise unable to continue. Something that deserved to be remembered, and something that was not permitted to be. The 2 empty plinths stand in the hall of the Imperial Palace, or they stood there, in whatever dimension of continuity holds that building in the 31st millennium. 10,000 years of the Imperium's subsequent history have piled up on top of the moment when they were left bare. The Horus Heresy happened. The Emperor ascended to the Golden Throne. The Space Marines were broken into chapters. The Long War began. The Great Rift opened. The galaxy cracked in half. And through all of it, those 2 pedestals remained bare, because whatever stood on them once is gone and cannot come back, and whatever it was must remain unmemorialized. But here, in this conversation, In this hour spent tracking the fragments and sitting with the mystery, in every comment thread and forum post and homebrew army and fan fiction that the Lost Legions have inspired across 30 years of the hobby's history here, something like memory persists, imperfect, incomplete, built from inference and imagination rather than fact, but genuine in its own way. The Legion nobody knows about is the one you hold in your imagination right now. And that, it turns out, is the most permanent form of memorial available in a universe that has made the destruction of memory into an instrument of power. Their watch is still not quite ended. Not yet. Not while there are people willing to ask the question. Part 5. Continued the Rangda and the Shape of Catastrophe. The Rangdan Xenocides deserve more time than they usually receive in discussions of this mystery, because they are themselves an extraordinary piece of world-building that has been kept deliberately obscure for the same reasons the Lost Legions themselves have been kept obscure. They are connected. The secrecy around the Xenocides and the secrecy around the 2nd and the 11th is not coincidental. It is the same institutional secrecy, maintained by the same authority, for reasons that are deeply intertwined. Think about what the Xenocides represent within the mythology of the Great Crusade as that mythology is officially presented. The Great Crusade is, in its public-facing version, a story of unstoppable human momentum. The Imperium expands. Worlds are brought to compliance. Alien resistance is overcome. The Emperor's armies move outward in a tide that cannot be reversed and cannot be stopped. This is the story the Crusade tells about itself, and it is the story that the surviving historical record, at least the accessible portions of it, broadly supports. The Xenocides do not fit this story. They are a period of multiple decades during which the Imperium genuinely could not identify a path to victory against a single alien threat. They are a period during which the losses were catastrophic and apparently disproportionate to anything the Imperium could bring to bear through conventional means. They are a period during which, at least temporarily, the narrative of unstoppable human momentum had to be abandoned in practice, even if it was maintained in the official communications sent home to Terra. They represent the Great Crusade being genuinely vulnerable, not challenged, not tested, but genuinely, potentially fatally threatened by something that the Legions and the Titan Legions and the Solar Auxilia and the full weight of the Imperial war machine together could barely manage to stop. The fact that 9 legions were involved, that the Emperor himself is described as intervening directly, that Titan legions were lost, wholesale and expeditionary fleets were destroyed with no survivors. This is a scale of emergency that the Great Crusade's official history has very little interest in dwelling on. The victory eventually came, but the cost was so extraordinary, and the implications of what it cost were so uncomfortable that the tendency has always been to acknowledge the Xenocides briefly and move on rather than examining them in any depth. The Rangda themselves are almost entirely unknown, which is itself significant. The setting is generally quite generous with information about xeno-civilizations, giving us detailed biology and culture and history for the Tau and the Eldar and the Tyranids and the Necrons, and even relatively minor species like the Demiurge and the Hrud. The Rangda, who came closer to ending the Great Crusade than any other external threat, are described in such general terms and with such deliberate vagueness that they feel almost deliberately erased from the record, which, given what we know about the institutional apparatus available for this kind of erasure, they quite possibly were. The specific capability attributed to the Rangda, the psychic or technological ability to affect consciousness, to introduce something into the minds of their opponents that alters behavior and judgment, is one of the most frightening weapons imaginable against an enemy like the Space Marine Legions. The Legion's strength comes from the quality of their warriors' decision-making at every level of the hierarchy, from the strategic genius of the Primarch down to the tactical judgment of the individual Marine in close-quarters combat. A weapon that degrades that decision-making, that introduces noise or distortion or false confidence into the cognitive processes of an enemy who is already difficult to overcome through physical means, is precisely the kind of asymmetric advantage that could explain how a single alien species nearly brought the most powerful military force humanity had ever assembled to its knees. The connection between this mind-affecting capability and the fate of the Second Legion's Primarch is speculative, as we have said. but it is the kind of speculation that the available evidence supports in a structural way. The alternative explanations that the second Primarch simply committed some act of conventional heresy, some policy violation serious enough to warrant removal, but without any of the external complicating factors, do not explain the timing. If the transgression was a conventional policy violation, it could have happened at any point in the Crusade, and there is no obvious reason it would cluster at exactly the period of the Xenocides. The timing of the disappearance in the immediate aftermath of the campaigns the second was confirmed to be participating in suggests that the campaigns themselves were the context for whatever happened. There is also the question of what the Rangda's defeat actually cost, beyond the obvious military expenditures. The Rangda homeworlds were eventually purged, their threat eliminated, the war concluded in Imperial victory. But victories of this kind tend to leave residue. What happened to the ships that had passed through heavily contested zones of psychic contamination? What happened to the warriors who had been exposed to whatever the Rangda used against their enemies? What process, if any, was used to assess the psychological and psychic health of the survivors? The lore does not provide detailed answers to these questions, which is itself suggestive. In a civilization that tracks gene seed with religious intensity and conducts regular apothecary assessments of its space marines' biological health, the absence of any documented process for assessing psychological contamination risk after the most intense and unusual campaigns in the Crusades' history is notable. The absence of process documentation does not mean no process was conducted. It may mean the process that was conducted produced results that were classified along with everything else connected to the Xenocides. Or it may mean the process was less systematic than it should have been, leaving some contamination undetected until it expressed itself in ways that could not be ignored. Either explanation fits the mystery. Part 8. Continued the culture of silence. The Space Wolves' role in the Lost Legion's mystery deserves more careful consideration because it sits at the intersection of several different threads in the lore that are each individually interesting and together form something quite significant. The first thread is the established role of the Space Wolves as the Emperor's executioners, not just in the metaphorical sense that all Space Marines execute the Emperor's will, but in the specific institutional sense that when the Emperor needs a Space Marine force to take direct action against another Space Marine force, the Wolves are the instrument he reaches for. This role is documented, in context, in multiple sources. The Night of the Wolf, the confrontation between Russ and Angron over Genna, is one instance, handled as a warning. The burning of Prospero is another, handled as full military action. And Russ's comment about this not being unprecedented implies at least one other instance that falls outside both of these. The second thread is the culture of the Space Wolves themselves, specifically the way that culture processes difficult service. The Wolves are a saga culture, built around the commemoration and celebration of deeds in story and song. Their institutional memory takes the form of narrative rather than archival documentation, which has significant implications for what can and cannot be preserved. Stories require tellers who are willing to tell them. A deed that the culture judges to be unconfigurable with its own values, a deed that cannot be made into a saga that a warrior would want to hear, that does not fit the narrative template of heroic action in service of something worth serving, will not become a saga. It will be processed privately, held by the individuals who participated in it, and when those individuals die, the memory dies with them. The Space Wolves, who participated in whatever action was taken against the lost Primarchs, or Primarch, carried those memories privately. They could not tell their stories in the Mead Hall. They could not sing about what they had done in whatever context they had done it, because the singing would require explaining what they had done, and to whom and why, and the answers to those questions were bound under the same institutional secrecy that bound everything else about the Lost Legions. They went to the Feast of Morkai, and drank with their brothers, and told stories about other campaigns, other victories, other moments of glory, and they kept this one locked away somewhere that the Feast Hall songs did not reach. The third thread is Russ's own psychological relationship with service that costs him personally. Throughout the Horus Heresy series, Russ is portrayed as a being who struggles with the disjunction between what he values and what he is asked to do. He values directness, combat on terms where the enemy has a genuine chance to win, the kind of warrior's honesty that lets you look at an opponent and see yourself reflected in the confrontation. He is deeply uncomfortable with subterfuge, with political maneuvering, with the kind of indirect and institutional violence that produces results without allowing for the catharsis of genuine combat. The things he is asked to do as the Emperor's executioner are often things that violate these values. They are asymmetric confrontations, actions taken not in the heat of battle, but in cold institutional necessity, endings that are politically required but personally difficult. If Russ was the instrument by which one or both of the lost Primarchs was removed from command, and the evidence suggests this is at least probable, if not certain, then the action was one of the hardest things the setting asks him to do. Not because of the physical difficulty, which for Russ is probably not the primary constraint, but because of what it requires him to be. The Emperor's wolf, sent to hunt brothers who may have been as much victims as perpetrators, ending something that deserved to exist and could not be allowed to continue. That is a specific kind of suffering that the Mead Hall songs are not equipped to address. The dark humor of the Prospero Burns, reference this is not unprecedented, is the closest thing to an acknowledgement of that suffering that Russ allows himself in a semi-public context. It is a deflection that works by being accurate while refusing to be detailed, a reference that establishes the reality of the prior service without describing it in terms that would require anyone to respond to it seriously. The humor keeps the conversation from going somewhere. Russ cannot afford to let it go in a room full of warriors who are about to do something very similar to what Russ is implying he has done before. There is also the question of what the Space Wolves knew in a broader institutional sense. Russ himself was present for whatever happened. His senior commanders may have been present. The rune priests, whose psychic gifts and long institutional memory preserve things that purely oral tradition might lose, may have carried some version of the knowledge in an encoded form that is inaccessible to outsiders. The Space Wolves are, in the 41st millennium, a chapter with a remarkable number of secrets, an unusual degree of autonomy from the broader Imperium, and a political relationship with the Inquisition that is combative in ways that suggest they are protecting something they do not want the Inquisition examining too closely. Is any of that connected to the knowledge of what their legion did in connection with the Lost Legions? Probably not in a direct, causal way. The Space Wolves have many reasons for their particular relationship with Imperial authority, most of which are documented. But the culture of a chapter that carries secrets it cannot share, that processes difficult institutional knowledge through the mechanism of saga silence rather than disclosure, that looks at certain questions from certain authorities with a suspicion that goes beyond ordinary Astartes' pride, that is a culture that has been shaped by the experience of knowing things it cannot tell, doing things it cannot commemorate. And the Lost Legions are among the oldest and deepest of those unspeakable things. Part 11. Continued the discipline of not answering. The broader question of Games Workshop's creative management of this mystery is interesting in its own right, because the decision to maintain it across multiple creative teams, across decades, across a vastly expanded publishing program, is not simple. It requires active commitment at each point where a writer encounters the mystery and has the opportunity to resolve it. This kind of active commitment to not answering is considerably harder than it sounds. The natural tendency in creative fiction is to explain, to flesh out, to give the audience what they want to know. The desire to be the writer who finally solves the great mystery, who provides the revelation that rewards all the years of fan speculation, is a powerful one. The fact that multiple generations of Black Library writers have resisted this desire, have instead contributed their small portions of texture and emotional depth without crossing the line into explanation, suggests that the commitment to the mystery is something that has been explicitly communicated and maintained at an editorial level. This kind of editorial discipline is itself a form of creative vision. It reflects a judgment about what the setting's long-term health requires, a judgment that the mystery's ongoing vitality is more valuable than the temporary satisfaction of any individual revelation. The setting can produce many different kinds of stories and many different kinds of revelations over its publishing life, but it can only do the Lost Legion's mystery once. The moment the answer is given, the option to not give it is gone forever. Every year that Games Workshop waits is another year of community engagement, another year of homebrew armies and fan theories and creative investment in a space that only the mystery makes available. The economic logic is consistent with the creative logic, which suggests that the decision is probably not purely one or the other. The mystery generates sustained engagement. The resolution generates a momentary spike of engagement, followed by a return to normal, and possibly some disappointment from the portion of fans whose imagined answer is not what the official answer turns out to be. The mystery is therefore worth more, in terms of ongoing community health, than the resolution. And the mystery is also worth more artistically, in the view of those creators who have thought most carefully about what the setting is and what it is trying to do. This alignment of economic and artistic judgment is relatively rare in large commercial entertainment properties, where the pressure to explain and reveal and give the audience what it says it wants tends to be enormous. The fact that Warhammer 40,000 has managed to maintain this particular mystery against that pressure, in the form of a setting that has become a major commercial entertainment property, with films and novels and video games and television adaptations in various stages of development, is genuinely impressive. It suggests that the people who have stewardship of the setting understand something important about what makes it valuable, and are willing to defend that value against the short-term pressures that might erode it. The Lost Legions will probably remain lost, not because nobody knows the answer, but because the answer serves the setting better unspoken than spoken. And that, for those who have invested years in the mystery, is the most satisfying kind of conclusion to a mystery that was never meant to conclude the conclusion that the question itself is the point, that the asking is the purpose, that the not knowing is not a failure to reach a goal, but the achievement of something more valuable than the goal. The question is the point. The question has always been the point. And the question will keep being the point for as long as those plinths remain empty. A note on why this mystery matters, beyond the hobby. There is one final thing worth saying, and it is not strictly about Warhammer 40,000 at all, though it lives entirely within the frame of this conversation about the setting. The Lost Legion's mystery resonates the way it does, sustains the way it does, generates the kind of decade-spanning engagement it does, not only because it is clever world-building, or because the setting is rich enough to reward detailed examination. It resonates because it speaks to something that is true about history in general, and about the relationship between power and memory in particular. Every civilization that has ever existed has done something like what the Imperium did to the 2nd and the 11th. Every sufficiently large and sufficiently powerful institution has, at some point, decided that certain truths were too dangerous, or too embarrassing, or too structurally destabilizing to be preserved openly, and has taken steps to remove those truths from the accessible record. The Romans did it with their condemned emperors, the process they themselves named the damnatio memoriae. The Soviets did it with the figures they removed from photographs and from official histories. The dynasties of ancient Egypt did it with pharaohs whose existence contradicted the narrative the current ruling family needed to tell. The early Christian church did it with the texts it declared heretical and burned. Every colonial power of the modern period did it with the histories of the peoples they conquered, actively working to suppress the records of civilizations they wanted to reframe as primitive or non-existent. The practice is as old as organized power itself, and it has never once worked perfectly, because the things that are erased leave traces. The absence itself is evidence. The energy used to suppress a thing tells you how significant it was, and the difficulty of maintaining the suppression tells you how persistent the truth is. History is more resilient than censorship, because history is not kept only in official documents. It is kept in oral traditions and in biological inheritance, and in the shape of buildings, and the orientation of roads, and the trace elements in soil samples, and the structure of languages, and the way that certain ideas resurface in certain communities without any conscious transmission having been recorded. The Warhammer 40,000 setting is a science fiction universe set in the deepest possible future of human history, but it is engaging with entirely human truths when it tells the story of the empty plinths. The truth it is engaging with is this: the desire to control memory is as old as human consciousness. The practice of erasing inconvenient truths is as universal as any human institution, and the erasure never works completely because the thing that was erased was real, and reality is harder to unmake than any authority likes to believe. The second and the 11th existed. They were real in the sense that anything in a coherent fictional universe is real. They mattered enough that removing them required the full institutional resources of an interstellar empire and the personal authority of a being who could rearrange the stars if he chose. And they persist in the form of empty plinths and scratched symbols and dark humor and the catch in a count from 20 to 18. They persist in the armies painted in colors that feel right for them, in the stories written to fill the space they left, in the questions that 30 years of engagement with the mystery have never quite succeeded in answering. That persistence, against all the forces that tried to prevent it, is itself the point. Some things that should be remembered find a way to be remembered, even when the memory is imperfect, even when the specifics are lost and only the shape remains, even when the only record is a pair of empty pedestals in a hall that most people never see, and a community of people who cannot stop asking what used to stand on them. The Imperium forgot the 2nd and the 11th on purpose, and we remember them imperfectly and incompletely, and with all the limitations of inference and imagination on purpose too. That refusal to let the erasure be complete is its own kind of honor. And the question that has no official answer and may never have one, is its own kind of memorial. The answer, if there is one, lives somewhere in the silence between questions. And the silence, it turns out, is exactly the right place to find it. Not because silence resolves things, but because it holds the space open long enough for imagination to do its work. Sleep well, whoever you are, wherever you are watching from. The mystery will be here when you come back. It always is. That is what makes it worth returning to. And perhaps that is the deepest truth the empty plinths teach us. Not about the 2nd or the 11th specifically, not about the mechanics of the Edict of Obliteration or the capabilities of the Rangda or the dark humor of Leman Russ, but about the nature of the Warhammer 40,000 universe as a creative space and a community experience. It is a universe large enough to contain genuine mystery, large enough to hold questions that do not resolve into answers, large enough that the not knowing is not a failure but a feature, not a gap but a gift, not an absence but the most enduring presence of all. The question lives. Go ask it somewhere else tonight, with someone else who has thought about it. See what shape it takes in a different conversation. The mystery is generous that way. It gives something different to every person who brings it their genuine attention.